Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third of the four-part Medicare Bootcamp series. This convenient and educational session is hosted by Region 10 chapters of HFMA. The topic for today's session is Reimbursement Compliance Foundations, and we are scheduled to run for 90 minutes. I would like to welcome our guest presenters for today's webinar, Jeff Fitzgerald and Ryan Thurber. Jeff Fitzgerald is a shareholder at Polsinelli PC. Jeff represents healthcare providers in disputes with federal and state licensure bodies, professional licensure boards, and other regulators and law enforcement agencies. He also assists healthcare companies that have proactively discovered potential compliance issues. Jeff uses his experience in resolving investigations to develop practical solutions that bring finality and risk reduction to compliance problems. Ryan Thurber is an associate at Polsinelli PC. Ryan brings a lifelong passion to healthcare to his work for clients at Polsinelli. Ryan's practice focuses on helping healthcare providers solve their legal challenges as they can continue to provide their patients with the very best care. He works with clients to navigate complex transitional matters and regulatory matters, including hospital, physician alignment, reimbursement, and compliance issues. So without further delay, I will hand it over for today's presenters. Jeff and Ryan, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for being here today. This is Jeffrey Fitzgerald, and I wanted to kind of start the session by saying how excited we are to continue this boot camp series for HFMA. And the goal of today is to go through kind of some of the reimbursement issues and how they overlap with compliance programs. So let me hand it over to Ryan to kind of walk us through the agenda and get us going.
Thank you, Jeff. As Jeff was saying, it's an absolute privilege for us to be with you all today and to spend some time talking through some compliance issues related to your reimbursement programs. The ground that we're going to cover today, if you've been with the boot camp series from the beginning, you know this is intended to be sort of an introductory 101 level discussion of compliance issues that are important to healthcare providers across the country. So with that in mind, we're covering some of the more basic elements and more fundamental elements of compliance programs. We're going to talk a little bit about the laws that healthcare providers across the country have to deal with and reckon with on a daily basis. We're going to talk about overpayments and refunds, which is an important issue, not just for reimbursement, but for all phases of the provider programs. And finally, we're going to spend the second half of our presentation talking about compliance programs, that sort of robust compliance effort that every provider needs to have in order to make sure that your operations remain compliant with the different laws and to ensure the success of your organization moving forward. So the first item we're going to spend some time talking about is the False Claims Act. This is sort of the granddaddy of all the compliance laws we're going to talk about because almost all roads lead here when you have a compliance issue, even if it's related to some of the other laws we're going to discuss later. The False Claims Act stems from the Civil War, from a long, long time ago, from a concern that federal government contractors were ripping off the Union Army and not providing guns that would shoot or not providing the number of mules they said they would provide, or just in general engaging in fraudulent behavior. Even though it has historical roots that go way, way back, it's now a crucial tool for the government to fight healthcare fraud. And at the bottom line, that the root of the False Claims Act is it penalizes any person who knowingly submits a false or fraudulent claim for payment to the government. It's important to note here that knowingly is not just about your actual knowledge, but it also includes any time there's a reckless disregard or a willful ignorance of a problem. So if you think, or if you have a good suspicion that there's something wrong with your billing system and your computer system, and you just decide to ignore it and go away, sort of like I do with the check engine light on my car, that can still cause problems for you under the False Claims Act. False Claims Act allegations and violations arise and follow two basic paths. The first is it's possible for the government to directly investigate and allege False Claims Act violations. They do that, but it's not as common as the second path that we're going to talk about, and it's usually reserved to situations where there's more egregious and more obvious conduct. The second path is more common, and that's called a qui tam lawsuit. And what a qui tam lawsuit is a private citizen sees and identifies what they believe is fraud against the government and is actually able to bring a lawsuit on the government's behalf. And that person will bring that suit, and the government will have an opportunity to review it and decide whether or not they want to intervene on their own. But if the relator, which is the name of the private citizen, continues with the suit and is successful, they receive a portion of any recovery that the government might have otherwise won. Qui tam lawsuits, for that reason, can be very, very profitable for relators, and they're responsible for the majority of the FCA enforcement out there. If a court does find that there's an FCA violation, it comes with very heavy penalties. So the first element is that there's a triple damages for any damages the government might have suffered as a result of the alleged fraudulent conduct. If you have, for example, a billing system error that causes all level 2 E&M codes to be coded as level 3s and submitted in that manner, and you wind up with $1 million in overpayments as a result, if you're found to have violated the False Claims Act, that amount's tripled right off the bat, so you're already at $3 million. But the real kicker, the real penalty, the real reason that healthcare providers are so afraid of the False Claims Act is the per claim penalty. So for every claim that you've submitted, if you go back to that example where you have the E&M codes, for every claim, every E&M code that was improperly submitted, the healthcare provider faces a fine of between roughly $11,000 and roughly $22,000. As you can imagine, those numbers add up very quickly, and that's a good reason why a large number, the vast majority of FCA cases settle well in advance of having to go to court.
And if you're wondering why the penalties are so large on a per claim basis, it goes back to what Ryan said as far as the history of the False Claims Act goes, where the history is military defense contractors. So if you're a military defense contractor and you're building a $10 billion submarine and you're submitting quarterly invoices, that invoice could be for hundreds of millions of dollars, but it's only one claim. And so in that context, really large per claim penalties made sense. However, the fact that they've been carried over into the healthcare context where you can have significant volume of claims all for $100 a piece, the same penalties still apply, even though the original intent is different. And because of that reason, it gives the government incredible leverage where they think they found something which is inappropriate.
And along those same lines, in the healthcare context, false claims allegations arise from any number of different places. But here are a few examples to keep in mind as we talk about how we're going to fight this type of issue through our compliance program later on. The first is pretty obvious, right? It's your outright fraud, where you're billing for guns you didn't actually send to the government, or billing for, in this case, services that you didn't actually provide. Those kinds of situations are obvious fraudulent conduct that obviously can give rise to False Claims Act liability. Other things that are not as obvious, you can have billing and coding errors that for some reason result in your provider receiving more money than it should have, or receiving money for services that it didn't actually furnish in quite the way that they were actually done. You can have violations of the False Claims Act that arise out of AKS and stark noncompliance, and we'll talk about those laws in a minute. You can have violations that arise from a failure to comply with Medicare regulatory requirements. For those of you that have been in this world a little while, there are conditions of participation and conditions for payment for healthcare providers, and it used to be that the latter was the only category that could get you in trouble under the False Claims Act, but recently the Supreme Court decided to blur that line a little bit. So from this point, and go ahead, Jeff.
And on that point, I think one of the primary areas you see the False Claims Act being used is to police other regulatory requirements. So it's not so much that the bill is false, it's rather the claim that the healthcare provider didn't follow all the rules and regulations they were supposed to. And we all know that there's lots of rules and regulations you're supposed to follow, and so really it becomes more a tool to police regulatory issues than billing issues, but it certainly covers billing too.
That's right. The next line item, medically unnecessary and unreasonable services. You will see this come up time and time again where providers have decided to inflate the level of care that a beneficiary receives, and the government catches them and charges them with FCA violations as a result. Last but not least, an item that we're going to spend some more time talking about later on, if you improperly retain an overpayment, if for some reason you get more money from the government than you should have, whether or not you meant to, whether or not it was your mistake or the government's, improperly retaining those overpayments can be an issue. We talked a little bit already about the financial penalties associated with a violation of the False Claims Act, but here's a larger scale look at why we care so much about this. The DOJ announced $4.7 billion in recoveries just from the FCA alone during 2016. And the Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General issued a report, and they noted that relators, those private citizens who bring the key TAM lawsuits, made over $500 million last year alone. Finally, over the last 3 years, from fiscal year 2014 to 2016, the OIG has enjoyed a 5-to-1 return on investment on the dollars they spend on healthcare fraud investigations. Meaning for every dollar that they spend investigating healthcare providers, they get 5 back.
And they trumpet that on Capitol Hill as much as they can to continue to increase their funding from Congress, and it seems to be working pretty well for them. And as you know, if there are investigators, they're going to investigate something.
So some examples of settlements that have come out this year. I did not go through and cherry pick all the highest dollar ones. I wanted to rather pick sort of a range of different types of entities and different types of allegations underlying these settlements so we'd understand just a little bit in what context these settlements arrive. But there's still some significant dollar amounts on here. $280 million from Celgene in July of 2017. The FCA claim arose out of improper drug marketing, basically alleging that the company was marketing their drugs for uses that were not approved by the FDA. That same month, an individual physician was settled a claim for $4 million, and it related to basically double billing for covered services. They related to pre-surgical consultations where the doctor would bill Medicare for the service, but then also go turn around and bill the patient as well. Earlier in the year, 3 home health agencies and their executives, we'll talk about that more in a second, settled for $19.5 million, claims that they were billing for medically unnecessary services. Pacific Alliance Medical Center settled Stark Law violation allegations that were brought under the False Claims Act for $42 million, and eClinical Works, an EHR vendor, settled for $155 million related to misrepresentations and allegations of kickbacks. As you can see from this list, which is not in any way exhaustive of the settlements that have come out in a given year, there are a number of different ways that you can get in trouble under the False Claims Act and it can lead to big dollars. For your review also is not just that the companies are facing these allegations, but the government has started to go after individuals as well. There was a memo in 2015 by the then Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates that outlined the government's process for pursuing individual defendants in these types of cases. And they have certainly started to do that and to engage and to look for individual noncompliance as well, rather than just focusing on getting a large dollar amount out of the entity.
And every time we share that information with people, I think everyone's blood pressure goes up. Probably everyone on the line here just kind of took a pause and said, oh, geez, I'm the CFO. Does that mean I have personal exposure? But at the end of the day, the False Claims Act is not a vicarious liability statute, meaning you can't be liable for the conduct of others. And so when the government is looking for individuals, they're looking for the individual bad actors who actually personally participated or caused the inappropriate action, not just people who knew about it or should have known about it, but were more directly involved.
All right. So real quick before we get to our discussion of overpayments, we want to talk about really briefly just some of the other key laws to be aware of. Each of these we could spend another 90 minutes going over, and we don't want to do that for you for this type of course, but we're going to mention them so that you have them in the back of your head. The first is the Stark Law. To the extent your organization has any types of relationships with physicians, the Stark Law is going to apply. It's going to, or at the very least has the potential to apply. It regulates the types of relationships, financial and ownership, that physicians can have with entities to which they refer. It applies only to a certain subset of services, but it's something you need to be aware of. So the key point here is that if you have relationships with physicians, you need to make sure, evaluate, and understand whether or not the Stark Law applies, and make sure that if it does, you meet an exception. The Stark Law is a strict liability statute. It's kind of like the speed limit. If the speed limit is 55 and you're going 56, you're speeding. It doesn't matter really whether you meant to or not. If someone's there with a radar gun, you can get a ticket. With the Stark Law, it's the same way. If you have a technically noncompliance with one of the elements of a Stark exception, you're technically in violation of the Stark Law. The second law relates more broadly. It's the same sort of concept as the Stark Law, but it relates more broadly to any referral source. And unlike the Stark Law, it is an intent-based statute, which means that you actually have to mean to try to induce the referrals from that other source, but it regulates any type of relationship you have with another entity that could potentially refer healthcare business to you. So in the same way that you keep an eye out for Stark Law issues, if you have a relationship with a physician, anytime you have a relationship with a referral source, you should pay attention to the anti-kickback statute and make sure that you're structuring your relationship to comply with that law. Last but not least, the OIG Civil Monetary Penalty Law relates to your relationships with your patients. It regulates the types of things that you can do to advertise, to bring patients in the door. And while there are a number of exceptions that are available, anytime you're engaged in an activity that's designed to encourage patients to choose your healthcare facility over someone else, you should pay attention and make sure that you're not running afoul of that law as well. And with that, we'll turn things over and talk about overpayments for a little bit.
Thanks, Ryan. And when you're thinking through the False Claims Act, to some degree, there are some intuitive aspects of it. You know, should we accurately bill the government? Probably a good idea. That's somewhat intuitive. Should we try our best and not knowingly violate any regulations? Again, somewhat intuitive that you should do that as well. However, one area which is significant, which has some less intuitive aspects to it, is handling Medicare and Medicaid overpayments. And as you all know, and this is maybe a little bit too cynical for this time of day, but the system in healthcare is quite complicated, and CMS has created an extremely complicated reimbursement system. And if you want to take the cynical point of view, what the government has recently done is basically said, our system's too complicated. We might pay providers inappropriately. How should we fix that? Well, we'll put the burden on them to figure out when they've been overpaid and have to pay us back. Maybe that's a little too simpleton for what actually happens in Washington, D.C., but to some degree that is kind of the practical effect of where we are. And because of that, the retention of overpayments or the failure to refund an overpayment continues to be kind of on the government's hit list. And it's important to note here that when we mention overpayment, we're talking about any funds you receive from a federal health care program that are more than you were entitled to receive. It doesn't matter if who's at fault or why you were overpaid, you were just overpaid. So if the carrier has a billing edit where they accidentally pay you twice for certain claims, even though that's their computer edit issue, you've still been overpaid, and the burden to refund those dollars falls on you. And of course, as people at HFMA certainly know, there are lots of different billing complications, lots of ways you can have overpayments for non-covered services, duplicative payments. The list is probably endless in the ways that billing issues can occur and overpayments can be created. Last year, the government really kind of tried to crystallize its policies and regulations related to overpayments, and it really did it in what I think is kind of a two-part test. Part A is if you have identified and you know you've been overpaid, you have to return that money within 60 days. And in my mind, that's kind of a little bit of the kindergarten obvious. If you got money that's not yours and you know about it, you got to give it back. Frankly, we recommended to providers even before this became the law that if you knew you were overpaid by Medicare or Medicaid, you wanted to give those dollars back because nothing but trouble would come from retaining federal money that you're not entitled to actually have. However, the government also made it more complicated and essentially said not only if you know that you've been overpaid, do you have a duty to refund, but now you also have a duty to inquire if you think you might have been overpaid, and that duty of inquire then requires you to figure out whether or not, in fact, you've been overpaid and how much, and then refund it based upon that. And the government did that through the definition of the word identified. So when the key rule is once you've identified an overpayment, you need to refund it, they basically said identified means two things. Either you've actually determined the amount of overpayment, which is kind of the typical plain language of what the word identified means, or that you should have identified or quantified an overpayment through the, and here's the magic language, exercise of reasonable diligence. And this is a provision which basically is now putting you on a duty to inquire and discover overpayments if you should have discovered them through reasonable diligence. And to some degree, that's kind of where the real rub of overpayment rules get into. So let's talk about that for a minute. So you might say to yourself, well, that's nice, but how do I know when I should have known about an overpayment? Or how do I know what exactly they mean by I should have determined it through reasonable diligence? And essentially, the government gives us a two-part test on this. The first test is whether or not you actually have a duty to do anything. And so if you receive credible information that you have a potential overpayment, it's that receipt of credible information which triggers your duty to do more. So to kind of put it in the converse, if you don't have credible information that you might have been overpaid, then you don't have any duty to do auditing or further otherwise look for overpayments. So this law does not create kind of a general audit function where you have to, even in the absence of information, go looking for overpayments. Rather, it is only triggered once you actually have credible information. The government doesn't really define what credible information means. I think we give you a definition in here, which is it's information which gives a reasonable belief that an overpayment may exist. I think it's kind of a common sense standard. If it's information and you think, yeah, that we might have a problem, that's probably credible information. The next step is once you've received the credible information, now your duty to inquire has begun, and that's done through the exercise of reasonable diligence in trying to understand and quantify the amount of the overpayment. And of course, the next steps that flow from that is you have to do the audit, do the analysis, you do the quantification, and once you quantify the amount, you actually have to go through the refund process, which of course can have its own hiccups as well. Often we get asked, okay, well, once we have identified a potential issue, how much resources do we need to put into it, and how long can it take to complete a review? And sometimes when you discover an issue, it can be complicated. You may have data deficiencies that make auditing difficult. In its guidance, and this is not legally binding, but it's just CMS's commentary, they said that they believe a good faith investigation should take no more than 6 months. I think that's a little naive. In my experience, a highly complicated cost report issue will take longer than that, and it really does become fact dependent upon how much time you have to review your credible information. But it is worth keeping that 6 month, outside guideline from CMS in your mind, and that may be helpful for compliance officers and other folks trying to complete these audits to help motivate the organization to move maybe a little bit quicker, so you can stay inside that timeline. In the final rule, the government also did give us some common sense leniency as far as how you conduct your internal assessment. For example, they indicated that if you identify a couple overpaid claims and you're doing a bigger audit, you don't have to refund the 2 or 3 probe claims first and then pay the rest later. You're allowed to do the internal audit as one complete process and then refund the dollars at the end. So there's no requirement to piecemeal things, which actually makes the rule a little bit more reasonable and easier to go forward with. Once you've completed your audit and have identified the overpayment, meaning you know what was mispaid and by how much, then the question comes, well, how exactly do we refund that to Medicare and Medicaid? And in the final rule, CMS essentially deferred to all sorts of existing processes. So every MAC and every Medicaid program has a voluntary refund process. Maybe we should strike the word voluntary from this, since it's not really voluntary, but a provider-initiated refund process. Every payment agent now has a process to intake those dollars. Most of them include a form or a specific data that they want you to provide to them. However, you can also use your automated claims processing system. So if the claims are still active within the electronic claim processing system, you can simply request an offset or make an adjustment or change the bill, and it goes through the regular claims processing operation as well. That's more handy for kind of more recent billing issues, but it is good news that we can kind of use regular claims processing edits and revisions to correct overpayments. So you don't actually have to send in a full disclosure every time. If you just correct the claims which were incorrect, even if the incorrect activity happened on the government side of the table, that will meet your obligation. In addition, once you have identified the overpayment, say you got back the audit report, the clock starts running on the 60 days to refund the dollars. There are some situations, however, where the government kind of tolls or extends that time period. One is if the dollar amount is beyond what you can pay at that time, you can request from CMS an extended payment schedule. They will ask for a fair amount of financial information from you to agree to that process, but when you request the extended payment schedule, and just making the request kind of tolls the 60-day reporting requirement. And frankly, that makes sense. Once you've told the government, hey, I think I've been overpaid by this much, but I can't write you a check for that right now, you've essentially disclosed to the government, which is meeting kind of the underlying policy of the statute. Alternatively, if you have made a formal disclosure under another disclosure protocol, that also tolls the reporting requirement. So if you have issued a self-disclosure under the OIG's voluntary self-disclosure protocol, which is more designed for criminal or significant civil violations, filing with the OIG tolls your 60-day period as well. Or if you file through the CMS Stark disclosure process, same thing. One of the common questions we also hear is, okay, how far back do we have to audit if we have a potential issue? And that really becomes a two-part test. One is, are there specific facts and circumstances which explain when you believe the overpayment could have occurred? So if you had a computer conversion in 2015 that is what caused the overpayments to exist, then looking back to when that computer conversion is the right time period, and you don't need to look further back. If, however, you don't have those kind of specific facts and circumstances, and it looks like the issue just kind of goes back into perpetuity, then the final rule tells us that the look-back period is 6 years at the most outside. And here we do want to note that that 6 years ties to Medicare only. It doesn't tie to Medicaid, so Medicaid programs may have different thresholds as well, so consider what states you're in. Frankly, however, 6 years is likely what most states are going to want to strap themselves onto as well. And so with that, let me kind of turn it over to Ryan to kind of walk us through what kind of compliance programs you should put in place to kind of catch not only these overpayment issues, but other issues of potential regulatory noncompliance.
Thanks, Jeff. So as Jeff was talking about, as we talked about earlier in this session, the financial dollars at stake related to regulatory noncompliance and related to potential allegations under the False Claims Act are really high. And they can be a significant financial burden for providers, particularly if you wind up caught with an issue that's a kind of long-standing or an ongoing problem. And the way to really try to mitigate that is to develop and implement and run a successful and effective compliance program. So we're going to spend the second part of our time together talking through that a little bit. The Office of Inspector General for HHS has published compliance program guidance for a whole bunch of different types of healthcare providers, skilled nursing facilities, pharmacies, et cetera. These are the guidelines we're going to talk about here are based on the hospital set, but there's a fair amount of overlap between them anyways, and if you're at a different type of healthcare provider, you can almost literally Google OIG compliance program guidance, skilled nursing facility, and you'll pull up those same standards for your type of facility. There's also a good chance that if you're on this webinar and registered for this, that you already work for an organization that has a compliance program in place. So if that's the case, use this as an opportunity not just to revisit why compliance programs are important, but also think critically about your organization's compliance program and things that you could do to step up or improve its performance and implementation across your organization. Compliance programs focus on a wide range of provider conduct. It's not just about retaining overpayments, although that's certainly part of it. It's not just about fraud and abuse compliance, which relates to the AKS or STARF laws. It's not just about those regulatory requirements, your conditions of participation. It covers a wide range of compliance activities, and really effective compliance programs cover all of those areas. The goal is to identify risks that are specific to your type of organization and your organization specifically. So for hospitals and then your specific hospital, and help you figure out how to tailor your compliance program in a manner that's going to effectively reduce the areas of highest risk for your organization. Frankly, there are so many rules and regulations out there that it's nearly impossible for any healthcare provider to comply with all of them, all of the time, in all of the right ways. So having an effective compliance program, one that's robust and administered in good faith, is important to help reduce that risk and to demonstrate to the government, if the time ever comes, that your organization is really interested in doing the right thing. The last thing I'll say before we move on is that it's also important to recognize that this compliance program guidance is really designed to be tailored to your specific organization. You know, physician offices and smaller healthcare providers are going to have much different levels of resources than gigantic health systems do to implement and put into place the compliance program. And your compliance program ought to reflect that, right? If you're a small physician practice, you don't need to have, you know, a gigantic compliance department to administer that, but you need to have policies and procedures that are reasonable and appropriate to what you're doing. So let's talk about some of that. The Office of Inspector General identified 7 elements. They're part of an effective compliance program. We're not going to list them here because you can see them and we'll talk about them each individually. But again, the idea is that you tailor these and you take a look at each of these with respect to your specific organization and design your compliance program so that you impact and you target those risk areas that are most prevalent for your type of organization. The first part of any good compliance program is having a robust set of written policies and procedures. Again, this is something that will vary based on your organizational size, but here are some that you should think about. A standards of conduct document is often the very first type of document that organizations will put into place when they think about developing their compliance program. It's simple and it's straightforward, and it has a lot of nice self-serving language in it about how we're all going to comply with the law, but it sets out your organization's commitment to comply with applicable laws and regulations, and it's sort of the foundation for building everything else. But you should also think about policies for claim development submission. For medical necessity, we've already seen settlements in that area where providers have unfortunately been caught billing for services that weren't medically necessary. Policies dealing with your financial relationships with referral sources, whether or not they're physicians or not, the AKS and STARF laws are something that your organization needs to be prepared to address. Financial integrity, these can be in connection with your claim submission policies, but you need to have policies in place to address bad debt and credit balances and any other number of potential financial issues that can arise throughout the course of operation. And lastly, consider whether or not, and you should have compliance as an element of your employees' performance. That means that you create an incentive across the organization, not just to recognize that there is a compliance program, but to incorporate those compliance activities into your daily life as an employee of the company. And encouraging compliant behavior and discouraging non-compliant behavior is one way to show the government and outside parties that your organization takes compliance seriously.
You know, one example of what we've seen some providers do on that is to have mandatory compliance education as part of every employee's annual review process. And I have one where if you don't complete the mandatory training, then you don't get your scheduled increase in compensation. So they hold the raise back until you complete all the proper training, which remarkably is effective of getting people to complete the training they may otherwise not want to do.
So once you have your policies and procedures in place and you've tailored them to your organization, you're going to want to build some type of organizational infrastructure around those policies and procedures to provide a mechanism for them to be, disseminated to your organization and actually enforced. The sort of first step in that process is picking a compliance officer. They're going to be the designated point of contact for any compliance-related issues for your organization. They're going to have a number of responsibilities, but it's going to include not just overseeing the compliance program, but also making sure that your C-suite, your leadership are informed of compliance activities and know what's going on. And they're also going to be responsible for coordinating those internal reviews and audit processes that we're going to talk about in a minute, so that when something does go wrong or when you have your program of scheduled audits, there is someone at the organization who has that responsibility to make sure those are followed through on and that any findings are accurately and completely described and then acted on. If you're in a large organization, consider whether or not a compliance committee or compliance department is necessary to help out your compliance officer. The good news here is that you can use your existing processes and resources to manage this type of organizational infrastructure. You don't need to go out and find 10 brand new people to be your compliance committee, but if you have a standing committee of your board, or if you have a group of people that's already dedicated to working on these types of issues, designating them as a compliance committee and forcing them to work through and to solve these issues together is one way to utilize your existing resources. Jeff mentioned already a little bit about what we're going to talk about here, but once you have that organization in place and you have the policies and procedures and you have the sort of bones of your compliance program ready to go, it's important that your employees actually know about your compliance efforts. If they don't know what your policies and procedures are, they can't act on them and they can't help you enforce them. So having regular training and education for your employees is extremely important. And it sort of covers in two phases, right? So you want to make sure that all of your new employees, the people that come in the door, are immediately introduced to your culture of compliance and are familiarized with the policies and procedures that you have in place. But at the same time, you also need that ongoing training for your existing employees. So, when there's a change in Medicare reimbursement rules, your billing and coding teams probably need a training on that. When there's a change in how various Stark law exceptions are interpreted, your physician contracting teams need training on that. You want to make sure that you have that program in place so that your employees are not only following your policies and procedures, but are actually up to date on what their requirements are. And as Jeff mentioned, one way to make sure you do that is to include that in their job description. The flip side of that training and education is a recognition that compliance is really a two-way street for any organization. So there's a good chance, particularly if you're a large organization, that your compliance officer is not actually doing any of the operational day-to-day tasks that require that compliance knowledge, right? So the compliance officer is probably not submitting claims to Medicare on the organization's behalf. The compliance officer may be reviewing physician contracts, but is probably not negotiating them. So there are people at the ground level, the floor level, that are interacting with these laws on a daily basis, and receiving and bringing in feedback from them and analyzing it is extremely important to having an effective compliance program. This means a really good compliance program has a couple of elements to it that are important. The first is that people should feel unafraid to approach the compliance department with questions or concerns. This can be part of making it part of their job description, but you want to make sure that if your billing and coding person has a question and a concern about how they're doing a particular service, that they can come and talk to the compliance officer and work through the issue without any fear of reprisal or any fear of disciplinary action. And at the same time, you ought to go ahead and just have an anonymous method for people to submit complaints or concerns or other issues related to compliance, so that if there is someone who doesn't feel comfortable talking about it out in the open, that they can still have a way to bring those issues to the company. The goal here is pretty straightforward. The goal is that you want any issues of compliance to be dealt with and addressed and handled internally, and you don't want to have it spread outside the organization. We talked about relators and how they're the largest source of False Claims Act violations. I don't have, or allegations rather, I don't have a specific number for you, but I guarantee you that in a large portion of those, part of the allegations and part of the fact complaint are, I told my company about this and they didn't listen. Or even worse, I told my company about this and then they fired me. So having an effective way for employees to communicate their concerns and to do so without fear of being targeted is extremely, extremely important. On the other hand, and this is the part that no one likes, your policies and procedures need to include disciplinary guidelines for when employees don't behave in accordance with your compliance policies and procedures. The good news on this is that as an organization, you have a fairly wide latitude to set what those disciplinary guidelines are, to set your disciplinary processes and procedures. But once they're set, whether that's a program of informal warnings, followed by formal warnings, followed by more severe action, whatever you've worked out with your human resources department, you need to actually follow through and enforce those guidelines. So where an employee has done something to warrant disciplinary action under your guidelines, you need to actually follow through and do it. There's very little worse than having the government come in and question your policies and procedures and then finding out that you didn't actually follow them as to the people at issue. In fact, that actually harms more, you might even say, than having no policy on this in the first place. Compliance programs also need to include a program of auditing and monitoring. And there's sort of two elements to this. The first are proactive audits that you do as part of a regularly scheduled program just to make sure that your organization is operating in a compliant manner. And again, this scales drastically with the type of organization, the size of your organization, and the types of compliance issues that you face. Right, a physician practice might engage a billing and coding expert once a year to look at their, to look at a small subset of their claims to make sure that everything is going all right. Whereas a hospital or a health system might have an entire team that does nothing but take a look at claims and other issues on an ongoing basis for the full year. Again, the important thing is to outline the expectations of the organization and your policy and then actually follow through on them. The second part of this element, though, is to have a reactive process as well. So when a complaint or an issue comes into the tip line, when you learn of an issue, from first-hand information or third-hand information, having a process to follow through and follow up on that information is extremely important. There's one case out of New York from a couple of years ago where an employee brought a spreadsheet of claims where they believed there had been an overpayment from the Medicaid program. And they brought that spreadsheet to their compliance department and they said, look, I think there's an issue here. We may have some overpayments. And that employee was fired. And the compliance department did take a look at the spreadsheet and decided that at least some of them were probably okay, so they didn't really look at the rest of the spreadsheet and just sort of set it to the side, and the person who was fired sued. And lo and behold, Exhibit A in that lawsuit is the spreadsheet, which did in fact contain examples of numerous overpayments that they just hadn't followed through all the way in checking out the spreadsheet. As part of this program, too, consider whether or not internal or external resources are appropriate. We'll talk about this more in a minute, but depending on the type of audit or the type of review you're doing, it may be appropriate to have an internal team that can look at it. It may also be appropriate to engage a consultant or an accounting firm, or if you feel like you need attorney-client privilege, to find a law firm. There are a wide range of resources available out there, and scaling that to the level of issue that you're looking at is also important. So the last key element that you actually identified is actually having a response to identified compliance issues. And we talked about this a little bit already, but the compliance officer, your compliance committee, need to have the resources and the means to follow up on compliance issues that are identified. They should again consider whether or not internal or external resources are appropriate. They need to take any kind of appropriate action necessary to resolve the issue, whether that's just amending a policy and procedure or winding up making a refund or a disclosure to the federal government. These investigations, as Jeff talked a little about in the overpayment context, should proceed with all reasonable speed. But again, the pace may vary based on your severity of your allegation, right? So if it's a complex and detailed cost report issue or claim submission issue, it will take months and months probably to figure out what the real problem is. If you know that all of your contracts with your physicians don't comply with the Stark Law, you need to act really, really quickly and get that taken care of. So again, as with all the other elements we've discussed, the response to these issues will vary depending on the size of your organization and also based on the type of allegation or the type of issue that you've identified.
It's worth noting that this is something you should have as part of your compliance program typically occur. And our system is too complicated for there not to be issues that need to get looked at. So if your compliance program isn't generating any hits where something needs to be followed up on, that may be a red flag that your compliance program isn't actually being effective, because a lot of things may turn out to be nothing, or they may turn out to be minor issues, but certainly given the level of healthcare complexity, and the ways that people can mess things up, you should expect to at least have some issues come up through the pipeline that have to get looked at.
Yeah. Thanks, Jeff. And with that, we're actually going to turn things back over to Jeff to talk about how you might want to implement the program for your organization.
So to get into this section, we were thinking kind of okay, let's assume that this is all new to you, or maybe your organization doesn't even have a compliance program, or you have one that's struggling and maybe you want to reboot it. So we kind of broke apart doing a compliance program or kind of implementing one into 4 stages. And frankly, what might be right for your organization is to just start phase 1 and try and get off the ground. Or maybe you're in flight and you want to make some fine-tuning changes. Or maybe you've got a program that's been around forever, but now it's kind of having problems. And so the goal here is to kind of give everyone some insight, kind of regardless of where you are in the continuum of the maturity of your compliance program. So step 1, if your organization just doesn't have a compliance program, or you have one that is just written on the shelf and no one's read it in multiple years, or you're newly hired as the compliance officer and what you thought you had isn't actually there, that's okay. Don't panic. You're not alone in that regard. And I will tell you, in the last couple of years, I've seen some relatively large and sophisticated organizations who maybe thought they had a compliance program but had turnover and reorganizations, and before you knew it, things just kind of went sideways, and when the new compliancer came in, she was shocked to find that some of the kind of 101 stuff you might have assumed a large organization was taking care of wasn't really there. And so start at the ground. Step 1, have a compliance officer. If you're a small rural facility, maybe you don't even have that role designated right now. Pick a person. In large organizations, maybe that person gets supported by a committee. Often that's how it's structured. And then start carving out kind of your core documents. And so step 1 there is draft a code of conduct. And a lot of times organizations have at least some uber high level statement of policy or goal or a motto about what they want to do. But here it's developing something more granular towards healthcare regulatory issues and laying out what the baseline expectation is for everyone in the organization. And frankly, drafting the document isn't all that hard. It's kind of floating around and making sure that you get genuine buy-in from the organization and the organization's leadership as well. This is the type of document, in my view, that should go to the board of directors and the highest levels of the organization, because those are the individuals who are responsible for, setting the tone of the organization, and so they should have a say in what they believe is the appropriate code of conduct or scope of conduct for the organization. Next step, conduct a risk assessment. And risk assessment is just kind of a fancy way of saying, look around and see what your risks are, what the problem areas are, or what they could be, and start building from that. And so the areas that you might have as a nursing facility are going to be different than the risks you may have as a physician practice, which are going to be different than if you're a pharmacy. And so start off by kind of identifying all the different risks you have, and then putting them in order of priority. So what are we doing now? What could possibly go wrong? Make that list, start sorting, and build from that. Don't be overwhelmed if the list is very, very long. That's okay. You don't need to do it all at once, but you do want to at least understand what you're trying to do long term and start at the top and work your way down. And as you do that risk assessment, if you see red flags or really glaring, really obvious bad things, don't be afraid to raise a red flag and start doing something immediately to address those issues. So if you're a pharmacy and you're dispensing expired medications, that may be something you want to stop immediately. And even if you don't have a process in place or a full set risk assessment, that may be just obvious enough where you want to say, okay, we do actually have some very immediate issues. Let's address those before we start chewing into more typical compliance program operations. So let's say you've done phase one, you've kind of got a baseline going, or you've come into an organization where they have a code of conduct. You've got a compliance officer and a committee that meets every so often, but not much more than that. What's kind of step two? Step two, is to start putting together the bigger blocks of your foundation. And in my mind, this means developing the written policies and procedures which become more specific to your organization and building out the disciplinary guidelines that goes with those. So it's having a billing policy which gives specific instructions for how we bill and how we don't bill and what information we have to have before we submit claims, and what will happen to employees if they don't follow those rules. And similar for different operational areas of your facility. And if you have a risk assessment, use that as kind of the guideline for how you build out your policies. So it can help you decide, okay, what policies and procedures we need. We need a lot of them. Let's start at the top with the most largest risk ones first and work your way through. And what has to go hand in hand with any policy development is training on those policies. So just issuing a policy is nice, but if no one knows about it, it's not going to do you any good. And so, frankly, the real rub is often developing an effective employee training program. So once you implement your policy, employees are taught about what the policy says and what they're expected to do. And frankly, as you begin doing that process of issuing policies, educating people on the policies, you should make sure you have lines of communication coming back to you, because as people understand what they should be doing, you have a high degree of probability that people come back and say, oh, that's not actually what we do, or we've been doing it differently. And that may or may not be an issue, but you want to make sure you have that line of communication coming back to you so you know. Nothing worse than having someone say, oh, we're told to do it this way, but we've never done it that way. I don't know what to do. And they feel like they can't raise a concern or communicate that concern backwards. Things will go sideways then. Your policy won't be effectively implemented, or maybe the policy needs to be tweaked. These things can be customized based upon your organization, and so what you think as you write the policy versus what actually works on the ground but is still compliant may be just fine. And so phase two is really developing policies and procedures, educating on them, and making sure you at least have a baseline level of communication coming back to the compliance office. Now, if you've been through that, good. You're getting somewhere. Often once you kind of get through these first two stages, the compliance program kind of goes on autopilot a little bit. It starts to perpetuate itself. You have, all new employees are getting trained on the same thing. All the staff has been trained on certain guidelines. And so you really have kind of the heart of the program kind of going at its own pace, which is a good thing. So next step, though, is to kind of flesh out more detail on policies and procedures as need be, especially for large organizations where have multiple business functions. This is where you really want to kind of think through, okay, do we have some high-risk ancillary functions that really haven't been adequately included in our compliance program? So if you're a hospital and you have this little pharmacy over here that you never really pay attention to, you may not have a compliance policy for the pharmacy, but you may want one to reduce the pharmacy's risk. And then you need to add in the next big step of doing regular compliance reviews and audits. And this gives you an ability to both proactively identify high-risk areas as well as review questions, concerns, complaints as they come in. So in this area, maybe you look at your operations, you compare it to the OIG work plan and say, oh, I'm a hospital and the government's really concerned about one-day length of stays. Let's do an audit on that this year and start focusing on some issues like that. And, to some degree, as this becomes more mechanized, you want to make sure you're following your disciplinary guidelines, and you're starting to document the overall process. Frankly, in my view, once you're kind of in a strong operational mode, part of the process becomes reporting out to the board or to senior management based upon your structure of what you're doing, what you're finding, how it's going, and educating the board so they know what they should expect to hear from a compliance function, because the board members need to be educated that the organization's in a highly complicated regulatory issue, and if we don't constantly monitor ourselves to make sure we're following all the rules, we'll take on excessive risk, or at least more risk than the organization may want to take on for legal issues. And of course, just because you have a structure going doesn't mean you're not going to run into problems, and problems come out of the woodwork in all sorts of different ways. But one of the key benefits and things you should do in a compliance program is when issues come up, you got to deal with them. To some degree, that's the role of the compliance officer and the compliance functions, to deal with some of the mistakes that get made or problems that come out or miscommunications that occur. And you need to deal with those problems as they come through. Sometimes this means you need to hire outside lawyers. Sometimes you need to hire investigators or consultants. Sometimes it means you really need to implement corrective action and monitor that the corrective action actually took. For example, I know a lot of physicians or a lot of hospital systems, once they start employing physicians, start providing E&M coding guidance and instructions to the physicians, and then monitoring to make sure the physicians are following the coding guidelines. Some of that can be a real challenge for physicians who haven't followed guidelines like that for most of their career. But you have to do that ongoing monitoring to make sure that you're complying the way you think you're complying. And ultimately, turbulence also can make you think through if you have specific sub-areas where you need to really, where you have heightened risk you want to focus in on, or maybe historically you've had trouble with credit balances, as we know here, or if you've had trouble, with collecting copays or billing issues, and you want to really kind of focus in on those areas and kind of drive them to drive improvement. And so let us kind of, as we're getting close to the top of the hour now, kind of share one more piece of information with you because it's timely. In March of this year, the OIG issued a set of guidelines, they call them, to help people evaluate their compliance programs. And we give you the link here. It's a 54-page document that tries to be a checklist that covers everything. I think it's written in like 8-point font, and it has a slew of questions. And to some degree, I think it's a little bit of overkill. But with that caveat, I think the OIG is designed it to try and be a helpful tool to the industry. And what you can do is you can take the 54 pages and start crossing out stuff that doesn't apply to you, and maybe you end up with 10 pages where you can actually use something the OIG's produced to be very tangible for your program. They've tried to develop it as a checklist and then list all the things that, in an ideal world you could do if you had an unlimited budget. But if you could at least say copy down the headings, or copy down the headings and, and one item off of each checklist and start scaling it down to your organization, it may provide for the folks kind of back in phase 1 or phase 2 a reasonable attempt to kind of assist your program. I think the OIG's view is you could, if you have a more sophisticated program, you could do it more as a kind of grade your program. So you could actually use it as a check, as a, go through, do a review of your compliance program, check all the boxes, and then grade yourself up. Okay, out of all the things OIG wanted us to do on 54 pages, we did, 26% of them, or we did one in each category. They're trying to develop ways to measure effectiveness, which is a difficult concept here. But this is one tool that is, frankly, while long, is in fact worth looking at. So we're going to have time for questions next, but just kind of to wrap us up here, let's keep in mind that, a lot of reimbursement issues have False Claims Act risk to them, because how you get paid and how you bill creates overpayment issues, it creates credit balance issues, it creates all sorts of claims issue, which go to the heart of the False Claims Act. And as Ryan noted earlier today, it goes beyond just actual knowledge, but what you knew or should have known, and the penalties are significant. And the only way you can solve that what you should have known box is to have a compliance program that sustains your organization. So we thought it'd be helpful to close with a couple of things which you can, leave the call today and think about, which might help you kind of make tangible first steps or further steps on your compliance journey. So one is, take a minute to understand what is actually your current status of your compliance efforts. So if, for the CFOs on the phone or people who have compliance options, compliance functions delegated to them, just pause. Okay, where are we right now? Do we have policies and procedures? Are we doing education? Do we have lines of communication? Go back through the 7 elements. Maybe use the OIG's extremely long checklist. But within a couple minutes, hopefully you could understand at a very high level where you are today with respect to your compliance program. And next, to think about, okay, what steps could we take to make this better? In the spirit of kind of continual quality improvement, understand where you are, and then ask, okay, how can we do this better? What risks do we have in an organization that maybe we're not focusing on? How could we educate better? Could we improve our policies? Could we improve lines of communication? And hopefully from that you can start developing a checklist or a thought process of where to go next. And one part of it may be getting more education on what's out there in the regulatory world.
All right, so before we go to questions, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, at least for those of you that are in the state of Colorado, the HFMA Compliance Conference is coming up in February of 2018, the 15th and 16th. Jeff will be there talking about the recent trends in enforcement. We'll have a whole bunch of other panels and speakers on a lot of different compliance-related issues, physician contracting, beneficiary inducement, even like clinical research. So it's going to be a great conference, and watch for promotional materials on that soon.
And so one of your next steps might just be send your compliance person or a delegate to that conference and help them understand what the next steps could be. And so with that, let's pause and turn to questions.
Okay, thank you, Jeff and Ryan, for sharing these timely insights with our audience. Before I take our first question, I'd like to remind everyone to type their questions into the questions chat panel located to the right of your screen, and we'll take as many as we can and time will allow. So our first question is about how to access the replay. The chapter will follow up with attendees of this webinar, and they will send the replay link to you. So and our first question is, what are some recent trends with respect to billing and coding investigations?
Good question. I think we really see 2 things, and then I'll let Ryan jump in with his opinion as well. Financial relationships with referral sources continues to be on the government short list of things they're looking at. That's a nice way of saying dollars getting paid to physicians or other people, but it's certainly larger than just physician payments. But anytime there's referrals and dollars, the government is concerned that they might be inappropriately linked, and that's out there, and the penalties can be significant. And second, there are, I think, kind of the regular, just day-to-day billing operational issues where, it's easy to step on a billing rule, and the billing rules are so complicated, but the government continues to investigate just kind of bad bills 101, if you will.
To add to that, I would just suggest that we've seen a lot of providers are undergoing an upgrade cycle for their claim systems, for their EHR systems, and a lot of state, like for example, state Medicaid agencies are doing the same thing. And anytime you have a big systemic change like that, it creates a real opportunity for miscommunication, for system errors that no one knew about, for a lot of potential compliance issues. And so it should be a time of heightened organizational awareness for all of you to make sure that you're following and tracking down any issues that might arise as a result of those changes.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is, we have heard of an advanced audit focus by the government on medical device credits and how those are reflected in Medicare billing. Are you aware of such a focus?
So the government has issued significant advice over the years with respect to medical device credits. And so for the whole audience can understand that issue, the issue is if a medical device like a pacemaker is recalled or under warranty, the manufacturer will issue a credit or give a free piece of product to the hospital when the pacemaker is replaced because it's defective, and Medicare is trying to find a way to share in those rebates or credits. They have changed their view of how they want to do that over the years, but frankly, it also creates significant complications for hospitals and hospital systems on how they track that type of information. There have been at least 4 or 5, maybe more OIG audits focusing on this issue, and it continues to be on the OIG's work plan. And frankly, one of the reasons why it may still be there is these are high dollar claims. So if a pacemaker is $15,000, you can understand why CMS is going to put some energy into making sure they get those credits properly reported back to them. And so that does continue to be on, the hit list for many large organizations where you're doing pacemaker procedures or other medical devices like that.
Okay, great. Another question, how quickly do most hospitals complete compliance reviews?
It's hard to give a one-size-fits-all answer to that. So I understand the question, but it's kind of hard to give a bright line because it does factor in so many different issues. I think if you get one done within, say, 90 or 120 days, that's really kind of breakneck speed for hospitals or frankly for any healthcare provider in my experience. I know CMS has said 6 months is kind of what they think the outside timeline is. I don't see that. I think probably most people have their reviews completed somewhere between 6 and 12 months. I think if you're running past 12 months, though, you're getting kind of long in the tooth. So I would kind of maybe double the OIG or the CMS time period rather than go shorter. But it varies.
It's something you can do to help on that front too is where there's a particularly complex review or complex audit that is going to take longer, just document that, right? Put a memo in the file or a note in the file that says, we have identified this issue and we think it's going to take 8 or 9 months to review because there are 1,000 upon 1,000 claims to go through, or for whatever reason it is. Just make sure that that's there, and so that if someone comes to ask questions later about whether or not you're proceeding with reasonable speed, you have documentation that's concurrent with the time of your investigation that shows why it was taking longer than someone might otherwise think.
Okay, and another question. Did you hear of the lawsuit that involves Epic billing, programming errors, and lack of understanding? Can you give your thoughts on this? Will the hospitals be audited by government through Epic?
Well, a lot of hospitals have Epic software, right? So we know that I can't profess to be up on every lawsuit involving Epic. Although I know that there is some dissatisfaction with that program, as there probably is with all software programs. Whether or not providers should be worried about the government auditing the functionality of Epic, I think that's probably unlikely. However, to the extent that you have glitches that come through Epic or your EMR software in any way, those can give rise to overpayments. They can give rise to inappropriate documentation or lost documentation, which is supporting your claims. And so you really can't say, oh, that's just Epic's problem, because you'll still be expected to have appropriate documentation in your record. That said, it is partially Epic's problem, and you can work with them and, not feel like you have to solve their problems for them as well.
Okay, and then our last question. What are some common internal barriers for the implementation of an efficient compliance program?
So I guess I would just say this, particularly if you're at an organization that is just starting out with development of your compliance program, or is really expanding from maybe a relatively straightforward code of conduct to a more fleshed out program, the compliance functions cost money, right? It's not you paying a compliance officer, particularly if you're hiring someone to be dedicated to that role, engaging outside resources to conduct audits, or even just using internal resources to conduct audits. All of that requires resources. And so from a business perspective, for those of you that are responsible for the compliance function and have to sell this to your business leaders, or sell this to a board, or sell this to someone else who maybe is not as attuned to these issues, the most important thing you can do is help them understand that while the compliance program costs money up front to operate and to put together and to get off the ground, in the long run, you save money, you save time. Large FCA settlements can be facility killers. They can be significant enough that you can't even operate anymore. And making sure that you have a program in place to reduce the risk of anything like that occurring is money and time and resources well spent. I think that's my biggest issue. I don't know.
I think sometimes you still have people who think that either they're in a rural area, so they're not going to get caught, if you will, or it's not one of their problems, or people feel like they're outside the scope of potential enforcement. And to some degree, I think that's like playing lotto. It may be true that if you are a small physician practice in rural America, the government's not going to care about you. It may not be true. I've seen plenty of cases where they've gone after 2 physician groups who billed inappropriately in their view. And if you want to roll the dice, you can certainly do so. But I think that kind of thought process can often be an impediment. And then, frankly, compliance programs can get complicated quickly. And I think trying to keep things simple as they grow can avoid, trying to do too much at once and kind of not doing it all well.
Okay, thank you. As we wrap up, I want to take this time to thank our members and healthcare community for joining this call. I mentioned that this is the third of 4 sessions. Our final bootcamp installment is scheduled for next week, November 14th, and the topic is CMS edits and ANSI standards. There is a separate fee for this session, but again, it is provided to an unlimited number of people within your organization. To learn more and register for this and other upcoming events, be sure to visit hfma-co.org. Also note you will be automatically routed to a survey at the end of today's webinar. Please share your thoughts and be sure to provide the email addresses of everyone in the room to ensure they receive proper credit. Thank you again to our guest speakers, Jeff and Ryan of Polsinelli PC, and everybody have a great afternoon.